I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Tom Hibbs. I'm happy to chair this panel discussion. We have two presentations that should take a half hour each, and then we'll take questions at the end of that. The first presentation is a collaborative presentation by two folks who are colleagues at Georgetown University, and is on the topic working together to help renew a wounded church and divided nation. John Carr, immediately to my left, is the founder and director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown. He served for many years as Director of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Served also as a residential fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics, and currently chairs the board of Bread for the World. Kim Daniels, in the middle here, is the Associate Director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought at Georgetown. She's a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Effective Communication and a consultant to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee for Religious Liberty, and was a lead advisor to the February 2019 Vatican meeting on the protection of minors in the Church, graduate of Princeton and University of Chicago Law School. Our second presentation will be by Mike Baxter from Regis University on reflections on friendship, colleagueship, and higher education in a time of cyberattack. Mike Baxter is professor of religious studies at Regis in Denver, received his PhD in religion from Duke before teaching theology at the University of Notre Dame and Catholic studies at DePaul. He's the author of numerous articles and is currently completing a book titled Against the Americanist Grain, Essays for a Radical Counter-Tradition of Catholic Social Ethics, a vintage Mike Baxter title if ever we've heard of. So I hand it over initially to John and Kim, and then to Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Congratulations. Tom was just installed as the new president of the University of Dallas. No time in purgatory for him. I'm really happy to be here, but have some mixed feelings. Nothing like being the last panel on a long day in a stuffy room after a very full and thoughtful conversation. Nonetheless, anytime Carter asks me to do anything, I say yes. I think what this center represents is an amazing achievement, and we just see it all around us. One of our great achievements this year in collaboration is not what Kim and I are going to talk about, but you can imagine Notre Dame and Georgetown co-sponsored in Washington a session on the global migration crisis. I offered an all-expense weekend, football weekend at Georgetown for my colleagues in exchange for an all-expense football weekend at Notre Dame, and they did not pick up my offer. Very upset. So I'm honored to be here, especially with Tom and Michael and my colleague Kim. I am anxious. I am not a philosopher. I am not a theologian. I am not a religious liberty attorney. I'm not really an academic. My experience with Catholic higher education before coming to Georgetown was paying for it. And my experience is the way the Jesuits practice the option for the poor is by making me poor. But now I teach and we work out of the president's office. We had a committee to come up with the most boring title we could find, an initiative on Catholic social thought and public life. One. It has the advantage of being descriptive. I am here, I think, because of the work I've done through the years at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I may not have the degrees and the knowledge that others had, but I had the most pompous title, I think, of anyone on the panel. How would you like to be Director of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the U.S. Catholic Bishops Conference? I was once introduced with that title, and a woman looked at me and said, "You need to do a better job." Here's how we're going to divide this up. Kim is going to take 10 minutes on some of our principles and foundations, and I'm going to offer some directions and dangers based on our work. But I want to begin with a true story. when I was at the U, about polarization, the perils of polarization and the value of friendship. When I was at the Bishops' Conference, there was a position open in the area of religious freedom, and a bishop came out and said they're looking to hire someone, and there is this person named Kim Daniels. Do you know this person? I said, no, but I'll check her out. And I went on the internet. I skipped over all her enormous qualifications, the good work she did, and looked immediately at the ideological attacks on her and her work and whatever. I came back and I said, I don't really know her, but this could be trouble. She ended up not getting that job, but a much more important job at the Bishops' Conference, advising the president of the conference and serving as a spokesperson. So with that, I'll turn to Kim for the rest of the story.
Well, and the rest of the story is very interesting and very parallel. And first of all, just about my background, I very much do come from that side of the Catholic world. I graduated from college in 1990. I was doing pro-life stuff in college. It was a very challenging time to be doing that. Robbie George was an assistant junior professor when I was there, and Russ Hittinger advised my senior thesis on community. I have 6 kids right now and got married while I was in law school, where I studied religious liberty. I used to read G.K. Chesterton and Robert Hugh Benson and all the rest in the late night drinking sessions, probably like many of you guys do talk about them. And all the rest, that's where I come from. I also was not a crazy right-winger in the kind of caricature that was out there in the media. I believe the Catholic faith, the teachings of the Catholic faith, was soup to nuts, and I did then and I do now. But in any event, I come on board as spokesperson for Cardinal Dolan in the middle of a big religious liberty fight. And again, there's all of this stuff out in the media about me being kind of a kook and out there and shouldn't be hired and all the rest. And it's a tough week for me. I'm not really a public person, despite that title, despite spokesperson in my CV, and was just really tough. And I got a phone call at the office, and it was John Carr. And now here's how I knew John Carr. I saw him as, I didn't know him. I had read stuff about him, his world, the institutional church, journals like America and Commonweal and NCR. That wasn't my world, big Catholic ministries, all the rest. And I knew him from what I had seen on the internet and what I had heard from other people. And so in my mind, he was the source of heterodoxy at the conference. He probably was suspect on pro-life issues and all that. He picked up the phone and he called me. And he said, my name is John Carr. I won't believe anything I read on the internet about you if you don't believe anything about me. How about we go and have lunch? And we had lunch. We had a great lunch, a long lunch. Realized that we agree on just about everything. And it was terrific, and it was the beginning of a wonderful partnership, a wonderful mentorship from John, who looks for opportunities to help young people everywhere, not so young people too. And it was a terrific beginning of our effort to bring civil principle dialogue to Catholic public life.
It only took 5 years for me to persuade Kim to come and join the initiative. She was part of our first dialogue and co-chaired our polarization dialogue she's going to talk about. But here's an example. If you put aside the junk, you can find out where you agree and you can actually do important work together. And Kim is going to talk about that work, and I'm going to offer some lessons on that.
So let's step back now and talk about where we are and the kind of challenging times we're in as we think about how to confront polarization. And of course, first of all, we live in an incredibly divisive and hostile moment in our political life. We're divided along partisan lines, and that obviously includes Catholics as well. As Catholics, we are facing the loss of a generation. Look at Christian Smith's work, look at the recent numbers from Pew. It's an incredible decline, and most very scarily among young women in particular, because if you watch young women's entry into the church and their commitment to it, that's a real bellwether of the strength of the church in the next generation. And then, of course, we get to the abuse crisis, which has led to a real loss of, first of all, to anger and anguish and incredible harm for victims, survivors, and their families, and everybody who loves them. And just such sorrow and anguish for lay Catholics and all Catholics, right? I mean, this is a huge, huge suffering in our church. Also, it's a great loss of moral credibility and a great loss of authority in public life for our church. So we really are facing a difficult time. In these kinds of challenging times, it's more important than ever that we bring Catholic social teaching and our Catholic principles to public life and to those conversations. And so with that, I want to talk about, maybe set the table, what are some of those shared principles that we might point to? And obviously this is a partial list. The equal dignity of all, regardless of how productive or unproductive or voiceless or weak or powerless they are. The responsibility to work together for the common good. Solidarity with the vulnerable, as Pope Francis so memorably says, resist the throwaway culture, whether it's for the unborn or for the undocumented. Related to that, community, resist the abstract libertarianism of the right and the left. Catholic social teaching is a moral vocabulary, it's an intellectual architecture for public life that can reach across lines, right? Partisan lines, ideological lines, ecclesial lines. So step back from that and say that while we think about these principles, we also need to think about the fact that they hold together as an integrated whole, okay? And that's what makes them so appealing in public life. They have an integrity to them because they're all resting in the equal dignity of people as made in the image and likeness of God. So how do we bring people together? One way to do that is to bring these principles to public life, to bring people with different perspectives to dialogue together about how to be effective in the public square, how to get past our division. We did that at a national convening on overcoming polarization in June 2018. And we brought together 100 leaders, emerging leaders and established leaders from ideologically, ecclesially, geographically, different perspectives and backgrounds, from the work they did to their views they held. A lot of them had only met online and had very negative views of each other. And a lot of them thought they were coming to clash and to debate each other. And that's not what we did at all. Our goals were to start genuine, productive dialogues, to build relationships across these divides, to lift up these principles of Catholic social thought as that intellectual architecture that I talked about that can bring people together. And we wanted to answer Pope Francis's call to look outward, not inward. John Paul II called this ecclesial introversion, right? Navel gazing, looking in at the church instead of looking outward at our mission. Like John Paul II, like Pope Francis, we wanted to move ahead and move outward, look outward from that. So here's what we learned, and it's not surprising because it's so simple and straightforward, and that's what the best lessons are. We learned that for these kinds of efforts to bear fruit, you have to root them in prayer, in the sacraments, and with a focus on our mission as Catholics to love God and to love our neighbor. A way to think about this and to remember it is to keep the focus on connecting and keeping close. Keep close to God, keep close to our principles, keep close to each other, right, our relational faith, both those we seek to engage and those we serve. So let me flesh that out a little bit. First principle is keeping close to God. At this polarization convening, we wanted to make sure that we had the sacraments throughout Mass every day, and it turned out to be such a powerful experience. It was obviously a visible source of unity, which is what it is. And when one journalist wrote about this later, it was so powerful. He picked out the image after a big long story about what we had talked about, what we had done. He picked out the image of people walking up to the front to receive the Eucharist. People, again, who had never met each other before, thought they had these disagreements. One person with purple hair, one person wearing a veil, and when they walked up and they received the Eucharist and they heard the body of Christ, they responded, Amen. And he said, hearing that together was such a powerful source. Second, keep close to our principles. First, I want to unpack this. We talk about working for authentic dialogue, rooted in truth and love, though, not in a false peace, of course. Dialogue often gets reflexively dismissed. It's one of those words. It's covered for something else, but of course, it's critical for self-government in a republic. It's critical for learning. It's critical to our faith and to the gospel. The alternative to dialogue is staying in your own bubble or echo chamber, and I'm going to let John talk a little bit more about why we need to resist that. Also, the word civil can be civil dialogue. That can be the most boring word in the English language sometimes. But we don't talk about it that way. We talk about civil principled dialogue. This isn't about a let's all get along or a least common denominator Catholicism. It's far from that. Pope Francis warns against a false and quietist peace in these kind of engagements, and we're not seeking that either. What we look for is unity by focusing on the beliefs we share, rather than focusing on ourselves and our tired internal disagreements. And we were so heartened to see that people who worked, say, on life issues on the one hand and social justice issues on the other, found out how much they had in common. They already knew that, but they learned it in person. We also saw that it doesn't mean, of course, that we equate all issues as having equal importance. That's not what we're saying either, but we are saying that when we can act and speak up on these issues as they hang together, we do so. Because again, this gives them integrity, this strengthens our witness across the board. And it's when we offer this kind of strong alternative voice in the public square that we can do the most good. Finally, keeping close to other people, those we're called to serve first. Sister Norma Pimentel was there. She does such incredible work at the border. You may know about that, her respite center in McAllen, Texas. And she said the word she hears the most often is ayúdame, help me. And she said, when you hear that word, it's not about whether you're right or left. It's about actually helping someone. In those situations, polarization does not come up. Secondly, keep close to each other. We talk about people responding not to an idea, right, but to a person, to an encounter. Professor McIntyre talked a lot about personal encounter, and there you had a question about social media and engagement. And I would just say that we really learned that it's that face-to-face personal encounter that can diminish hostility and really make people understand that we are in this together. Finally, these are the lessons we drew from that crisis. We draw similar lessons from our latest convening this past June on the clergy sexual abuse crisis. Trying to pull people together to make sure that we try to respond to this incredible harm to our church, incredible suffering that we're undergoing, particularly victim survivors, means reaching past the kind of polarization that has divided us. These same principles were there, and it was wonderful to see people again come together and try to do this because we had such an important role. And I'll just end with something Pope Francis wrote in his letter to the U.S. bishops when they were getting together to talk about, to be on retreat in response to the clergy abuse crisis. He said, this is not about marketing or strategizing. It is about a clear and decisive focus on our gospel mission. It's about the beating heart of the gospel. That's where we need to keep our focus. That's what we're hoping to do in our work. And those are the kinds of principles that we think can root a response to polarization. There's a lot more to be said. I think that we need to talk about being humble and bold. That's one of the lessons we took from our convening. Humble in listening to other people, bold in asserting ourselves in the public square. And we need to resist the kind of mean environment that we're in. We can't fall prey to that, to the hostility that social media in particular seems to encourage and promote. But I'm going to let John turn to that, and then maybe we'll jump to that afterwards. Thank you.
Working with Kim is not about any particular ideological or political conflict, but sharing 30 minutes in one presentation is a lot of work. I just cut her off, and now she is going to have the pleasure of cutting me off. I want to offer, in this context, we have a wounded church, we have a divided nation, and we have polarized, I would say demoralized politics. So what are the lessons? What are some directions and dangers? I'm going to offer as many as 10 directions as I can fit in 10 minutes. First of all, to reinforce what Kim said, faith first. We're a party of the body of Christ. We're the people of God. We are not the Democratic Party of Prayer. We are not the Catholic caucus of the Republican Party. Catholic, as you well know, it's two meetings. We're disciples of Jesus Christ, part of his body. We also reach out to all. The idea of missionary disciples implies both of those, that we hold fast. We are disciples of Jesus and his church, and we reach out to share that. Some of us are better at holding fast, and others are better out at reaching out, and we need to find a way to put those things together. We need to share the good news. Number two, it's good news, even in tough times, and we ought to act like it. The joy of the gospel is not shared effectively by angry, judgmental, unhappy people. A friend of mine reminded me, no one likes a grim do-gooder. And I would suggest no one's crazy about a culture warrior or a social justice warriors. Warriors don't make friends, they attack enemies. There are two kinds of leadership in my experience. One is if you think we've lost, if you think the culture's overwhelmed us, then you hunker down and try and preserve and protect what we have. And sometimes I feel like that. If you believe we have what this world needs, Then you reach out, you engage and persuade. This conference, this center, this university are engage and persuade kind of leaders, and I think we need to be as well. Humility helps. The most important words I've learned in a conversation before I state my absolute truths is I could be wrong about this. It took me a long time to learn this. Frankly, it's good news. Ain't it awful? Which is frankly how I talk a lot of the time. That just leaves me sad and mad. We can do better empowers me, challenges me. Number 3, part of that path, as Kim has suggested, to doing better are the principles of Catholic social teaching. My experience at Georgetown, at Harvard, I have to work that in. I was a fellow at Harvard. When we told our family that I was going to be a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard, my son Tim said, "Are we talking the real Harvard?" What I found is young people, and I think a lot of us, are looking for a moral vocabulary, are looking for an alternative to business as usual, want to find ways to live with faith and integrity. Kim outlined some of the principles. I insist over and over again, the most important word in Catholic social teaching is the word and, A-N-D, human life and dignity. I work a lot on the Hill. Richard Dorflinger, my friend, we used to team up. When we were trying to keep abortion out of the healthcare bill, somebody asked to see our boss, and they said, don't take this wrong, Richard. They said, the fat bald guy crossed the line, took me on in a way that was inappropriate. And our boss's comment was, which one? That's not how the world thinks about human life and dignity, human rights and responsibility, subsidiarity and solidarity. Subsidiarity isn't even in the spell check for work. The dignity of work and the rights of workers. Care for creation and care for the poorest people on earth. We can go on and on, but and is the most important word. But, B-U-T, is a dangerous word. I used to say, all life is sacred, but the unborn need protection, but that's not all there is. And others would say, protection of life begins with the unborn child, but it doesn't end there. What if you change those sentences and use the word and? All life is sacred, and it ought to begin with the unborn child. Number 4, before I get it, if you reduce Catholic social teaching to a full endorsement of your ideological assumptions and policy preferences, you're talking about yourself, you're not talking about Catholic social teaching. It doesn't fit. Number 4, find a home and get out of the house. We all need a spiritual, intellectual home where we are loved and can love others, where we find an anchor for what we believe and the strength to share what we believe, a place that challenges us and supports us. But if in your home, everybody thinks like you, looks like you, prays like you, talks like you, votes like you, you need to get out more. Diversity of opinion, of race, ethnicity, class, politics is not a nice thing. It's not an option, it's an obligation. Morally, ecclesially, politically, in every way. Number 5, does your faith shape your politics, or is it the other way around? American politics is increasingly tribal. It's becoming a dominant source of identity and a substitute for religion with its own orthodoxy, heresies, sacraments, devils, and deities. And sometimes it can become a cult. I've worked all my life with evangelicals, and I cannot understand how leaders can embrace the president in every possible way. And I work with a lot of progressives who frankly will make excuses for almost anything in the name of partisanship. The bishop's statement on faithful citizenship is going to be discussed. Here is my summary. For institutions and for a place like a university, we need to be political without being partisan. We should not be chaplains to any party, cheerleaders for any candidate. We should be principled but not ideological. We should not compromise on that all life is sacred or that the poor ought to come first, but we ought to work with anybody we can to advance those values. We should be civil but not soft. We should be clear about our principles, but challenging the motives or the faith of others is not a way to persuade others, and we should be engaged but not used. We need to advance our agenda, not be used to advance others. Let me skip a couple of these. Let me say something about institutions. Institutions tie us down. They also free us up. We're part of a big institution, the Roman Catholic Church, and a central part of that institution is the papacy. I always thought the question is whether I agree with the Pope, not whether the Pope agreed with me. And frankly, I am disheartened and in fact disgusted by the current pick-a-pope ecclesiology that is dividing elites in the Catholic community. We hear about the JP2 generation, Team Francis, even that Benedict is the real Pope. In fact, I think there is much more continuity and conflict, whether it's environment or the death penalty or the advantages and limitations of the market. I think you can draw a straight line. There's a lot of talk these days about fidelity versus mercy. I'd like to propose empathy as a virtue for our time. We need to listen more, to learn more, to accompany people. Imagine if you didn't have health care and your kids were sick. Imagine you were facing having a child by yourself. Imagine being so afraid for your children's lives that you would walk thousands of miles to find a better life. Imagine losing your business because you stood up for what you believe the Bible says about family. Or imagine losing your job because someone found on the internet that you were part of a same-sex relationship. The clergy abuse crisis, I think, should bring us together. I fear it will tear us apart. It's not about ideology or theology, it's about the abuse of power and trust. Finally, we're in this together, and we ought to act like it. You know how it goes. Liberal conservatives, pro-lifers, social justice folks, Anglos, Latinos, academics, practitioners, the liturgy people, and the rest of us. We should not be chaplains to factions, cheerleaders for one side or one pope, frankly. We can divide up the work, but we shouldn't divide up the church. Friendship makes that possible. Thank you very much.
Now me?
Professor Baxter, yes, please.
I suspected when I saw this lineup that I would regret speaking on what I'm speaking. I kind of waded into an area that I don't know too much about, but would rather talk on the topic that we just heard. But we'll save that for question time. I have a lot of thoughts. I want to speak today about friendship, somewhat indirectly, regarding what has happened at Regis University in Denver. So I'm going to read my paper. I might interrupt myself with 2 points. You want to stop me? I see these ominous signs. You can tell me to shut up at some point, but I think we'll be okay. On Thursday, August 22nd, I drove to work expecting to finish my course descriptions and syllabi a full 5 days before my first classes. People who know me know this is a remarkable piece. But on the way, I heard that the computer system at Regis had been invaded by malware. Josh Evans, a friend of mine, psycho-Catholic like Joe works here, I joke with him all the time about this. I think humor is an important bridge, too. A friend and colleague who teaches medical ethics saw on his Dropbox files early that morning words to the effect of, "Regis, you are under attack and will not be released until you meet our demands." No one on campus knew exactly what was going on. But by the end of the day, it sounded like Josh's story was right. We were under cyber attack. Once the IT department realized what had happened, in the middle of the night before, the entire system was shut down. Everything was off. The Regis website, email, world-class, computers, Wi-Fi, copying and scanning systems, and telephones. The Denver Post ran a headline about the crisis a few days later, "Regis Unplugged." Like many of us, I had read about the fragility of the web, along with the news of a string of attacks in recent years, the North Korean attack on Sony Pictures, the breach of security at Target, Equifax, Capital One, the city of Baltimore in May of this year, and the attack of 20-some small cities in Texas just a few days before. In fact, one rumor has it that the attack on us was related to the attacks on those cities in Texas. So it occurred to me that if this cyber attack is like these other cases, it could be quite a while before it ceases. So I went to my office on Saturday, August 24th, day 3 of the attack, to run off 3 weeks' worth of readings that I would distribute to students hard copy. This was on one of the few copiers that was still open at Regis, and I found out about it. In this regard, many younger faculty members were at a definite disadvantage. They had never taught without having had the readings available online, and in some cases had never taken college classes without it. I, on the other hand, and a few other old-timers, I was in my original element. I ran off my copies, put them in stacks, lugged them to my classroom, and announced that we'd be reading hard copies this semester together without benefit of online resources. No PowerPoint, no YouTube videos, no computers on at all, which meant to my relief, no fact-checking my lecture. We'd be going old school. My new teaching model for the semester became, the course pack is back. I also asked the students what hardships they were facing due to the cyber attack. They were not insignificant. Tuition discounts were held up. At Regis, you pay the full tuition and then you get it back with a reimbursement check. But with no computers, no checks. And that meant no way to pay for rent, utilities, gas, and bills. Work-study jobs got canceled, putting students in the same position. Then there are the online courses. If you consider that Regis has 3 graduate programs in the health professions, nursing, pharmacy, physical therapy, all heavily dependent on computers, not to mention the business school programs, along with, ironically, a program in cybersecurity. See how these programs would be brought to a standstill. There were real hardships. But around these dark clouds, I could not help but see some silver linings, some good things emerge. It started on day 1 of the attack. People were talking with each other. At first, of course, about what was happening, but at length about other things too. How are things going? What's new with your family? I'm domiciled in the Office of Mission. 15 feet away is the office of Marie Friedman, PhD, the director of Jesuit Worldwide Learning, who coordinates students around the globe, get this, Asia, Africa, refugees in Syria, and elsewhere, receiving advanced degrees in higher education. I had not stopped to speak with her for 2 minutes in the year and a half I've been there, until the week of the attack. When I learned more of what she does, that her job had been brought to a standstill more than anyone's, that she has a sense of humor, and that she had ideas for plotting workaround schemes, such as bringing your own computer and printer into the office since ours had been quarantined. I had a personal relationship with her because we had time, especially she. Because the Regis email was down, Dan Justin on the other side of Marie Friedman's office would pop into my office to alert me about upcoming meetings instead of emailing me. I remember there was a point in my life where someone would email me and they were an office away. I thought that was the weirdest thing. Now it's just routine, right? We'd also chat about articles or books to read and what we were working on. In the provost's office nearby, the staff would be talking in the lounge area while a dozen computers were sitting idle. I found myself wondering, how necessary is the data contained in these computers? And what ideas were coming from these free-flowing conversations? Another thing I noticed, with no Wi-Fi, I got more writing done. Alone in my office, with nothing to do except to write, look out the window, and then write some more. Instead of check my email, try to judge report, and all the other news reports. As the crisis continued into 2 and 3 weeks, we received hand-delivered daily updates. And the regular rotation, of course, meetings were canceled. There would be no student course evaluations this semester. It's kind of freeing, you know? And the regular rotation of assessments, goals, objectives, outcomes, all presentable in measurable, quantifiable data, would be suspended. It was with this last announcement that I started to ask, why couldn't it be like this all the time? Why couldn't it be more like it used to be? At first I said this only in jest, but it gradually occurred to me that this was a valid and important question. After all, there was plenty written about how academic life has become more bureaucratic, more frenzied, less personal, less conducive to creative teaching and scholarship. In The Slow Professor, Maggie Berg and Barbara Sieber said about, quote, challenging the culture of speed in the academy, as they put it in their subtitle, a culture that is generated by digital life, which, while making for efficiency, also allows for more distraction. The solution for them is not found in all the self-help academic success books, you know, get up at 4 a.m. on Saturday morning and write that book, but in cultivating a sense of timeless time, a deliberately slow pace and process that gets beneath the fragmenting and disruptive power of our schedules. The only problem, they report, is that too many academics see this as nostalgia, as wishful thinking, a flight from the real world, utopian. And yet, this is not really true, because we used to do things differently. In fact, to take one example, in the early 2000s, the process of turning in grades at Notre Dame became as simple as clicking a mouse, submit. Prior to that, you had to fill in the circles with number 2 pencils and take the computer sheets over to the registrar's office on the bottom floor of the main building, where the nice women would take your paperwork and give you a cookie. After which I would make a stop at the grotto, offer a prayer for my students, and then maybe go see Dave Solomon if he's in his office and wants to go to lunch. Is there something lost in the more efficient patterns of work? Something along the lines of space for friendship among colleagues in higher education? These are not unlike questions posed by Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si at the outset. Francis notes the problem with what he calls rapidification, whereby, quote, the speed with which human activity has developed contrasts with the naturally slow pace of biological evolution. I note that he did this. I read this on the day that it was released, and by then there had been a slew, 20 plus, commentaries on Laudato Si, you know, John Allen, 10 takeaways from the Laudato Si that they must have written in, you know, a matter of minutes. You know, some of them were embargoed, but the onslaught of commentary by noon of that day was unbelievable. rapidification. The Pope is addressing the ecological crisis, but his point applies to digital culture and higher education as well. He urges us to cultivate a slower, more integrated, more contemplative approach to our lives together, including our working lives. And in doing so, he calls into question our deep, almost slavish dependence on technology and what he calls the, quote, dominant technological paradigm that has prevailed for 2 centuries since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. His approach is nuanced. He does not condemn technology itself, but he insists that our development and use of technology must be proportioned to our true nature, which can only be properly understood when we overcome the modern intellectual habit of placing ourselves at the center of the universe to rule and master nature, instead of situating ourselves in relation to God and all creation. It's a brilliant movement, encyclical. The anthropomorphism that lies at the theoretical core of justifications for abusing the environment, neglecting the poor and the marginalized, aborting the unborn, needs to be offset, countered with a theocentric perspective. This is our argument, chapter 2. In making this argument, Francis relies on a book titled The End of the Modern World by Romano Guardini. The book was written in the 1950s, in the wake of the Second World War, in an effort to challenge the unlimited exercise of power that he argues emerged in modernity. Obviously, he's looking back at the Nazi era. In explaining the problems with the technological paradigm, whereby technological advance is assumed to be a good without addressing questions as to how the technology will be used, in what contexts, in what ways, and to what ends. His Holiness writes in a passage interspersed with quotes from Guardini, technology tends to absorb everything into its ironclad logic, and those who are surrounded with technology, quote, know full well that it moves forward in the final analysis neither for profit nor for the well-being of the human race, that in the most radical sense of the word, power is its motive, lordship over all, including, as the Pope goes on to explain, politics and economics, and also, we should add, education. Guardini expressed much the same concern in his Letters from Lake Como, written remarkably in the 1920s. Reflecting on the changes that had overtaken the place of his youth, he noted how the sailing vessels are now replaced by steamers, plows by tractors, the open hearth by coal stoves, carpentry and bricklaying and cabinet making are rendered superfluous by prefab houses in the 20s, all contributing to a life that is more artificial, more barbarian, less human. Guardini lists several cultural features that characterize this new process: the tendency to abstraction in thought, to universalism, to an over-reliance on statistics, surveys, systems, mechanisms that allow for mastery. He openly wonders if we will be able to place the vitality and creativity giving rise to these changes into a setting in which they can be properly ordered to a human and humane end. In the conclusion, it seems, he's not so sure. Guardini was not alone in raising alarms about the dark side of technology. Joseph Pieper, also writing in the post-World War II era, posited leisure as the basis of culture to counter these same basic forces, which he saw as reducing the human person to the status of a worker, proletarian, meant only for producing, analyzing, organizing at a rapid pace around the clock in order to increase profitability, either for the sake of the state in the communist East or for the owners and managers of industry in the capitalist West. The antidote, he said, is to restore a sense of the whole, to recapture a sense of festivity, of the joy and play in life, by means of a mode of knowledge brought about not by productive activity, but by passive receptivity, that is to say, by means of contemplation. The role of technology in our lives was also addressed by another mid-century Thomist, namely Yves Simon, who's buried right 500 yards that way. Role of technology, in the conclusion to Philosophy of Democratic Government, Simone takes up the issue of technology, noting that it creates settings, economic and political, that frustrate the person's authentic capacity for self-government. And for Simone, as an Aristotelian, this is a crucial matter because without the capacity for self-government, one lacks the ability to exercise the practical reasoning needed to negotiate our way through these impersonal bureaucratic settings and determine how, when, where, why, and in what ways we can shape our relationship with computer technology. One example of this Aristotelian practical wisdom, phronesis, comes in Wendell Berry's essay, Why I'm Not Going to Buy a Computer, published in Harper's December 1988, and republished in his essay collection, What People Are For. On the basis of several well-thought-out criteria for using new technology, does it cost less? Does it result in better work? Does it use less energy? Can it be fixed locally? And so on. Barry concludes that he won't be using a computer, but will be sticking with his Royal Standard manual typewriter bought in 1956, and of course, a pencil or pen and a pad of paper, and a reliable proofreader, his wife. He caught a lot of hell for his wife. It's a great review. Read this. It certainly has worked for him. His writings have now been collected in 3 volumes of the Library of America. I'm not sure this stance would work for many of us in academia. There may simply be too many research resources readily available on the web. It's just unbelievable. Archives, journals, books, and so on. But what we need is a communal setting like that of Wendell Berry's in order to sort through these complicated matters. And by setting, I mean a group of people whose lives are devoted to their common good as well as to pursuing each of their individual and familial goods. We need, in other words, a polis. And universities, I think, can qualify as a polis in this Aristotelian sense, at least ones of a certain size, with people, faculty, staff, students, sharing certain beliefs in common, including a commitment to an intellectual tradition or traditions, to teaching and learning, to serving others, to the overall purpose of the university. In teaching the Aristotle, I often invite my students to think of Regis University as a polis. In doing so, I hope to help them understand and sympathize with Aristotle's claim concerning the interdependence of politics, the practice of achieving the good in common, and friendship. What the Cyberattack has done for us at Regis is open up the possibility of recognizing how our life and work together is so deeply dependent on digital technology and to consider the ways it could be enhanced by making ourselves less dependent on it. The first way in which this occurred was simply by giving those who work together there a greater collective identity. It was a crisis that affected everyone. It brought us together like snowstorms in the Midwest, bringing people together. When people are more cognizant of each other and their concerns. Everyone was more aware of what the IT department does. People in IT reported that they became more aware of people within departments in IT do. People learned how it affected those in other colleges. So the sense of specialization and fragmentation began to give way to a more common identity. We had little mottos too. Keep calm and Regis on. That was what it was. It also created commonality between faculty and students, for we were all in the same boat with emails failing, assignments not posting, tests and exams running late. More importantly, there was a more personal touch to the interactions between students and faculty. Papers were graded by hand in the penmanship of the grader. I still have Howard Watson's comments on stuff. I still go back and read them. They're not easy to read. But, with no email, more students came by during office hours to ask about something. And there was a deeper sense that the class was going to occur in the classroom. rather than being dispersed with everyone together, rather than being dispersed with, through online bulletin boards. And finally, most importantly, it created a common ground among faculties for the simple fact that there was more time, what with fewer meetings, no department and college-wide assessments to do, and so on. And with more time comes more conversations about what we're teaching and working on. I mean, this is, after all, why we got into academia. And an added factor here is that with online resources down, intellectual conversation is more likely to occur locally, where you talk more with people in your department rather than with grad student colleagues over the phone. In kind of a national, rather than have a national conversation, you had to confront people locally, and the differences are real. But it can be surprisingly fruitful. In other words, with our online capacities down, we found ourselves drawn into talking more with our colleagues. In these and other ways, we have found ourselves gifted with the time and space for cultivating and renewing friendships in all the varieties and permutations discussed by Aristotle. Utility, pleasure, among equals, among those who aren't equals, younger, older, and most importantly, true friendship based on a common pursuit of good. In this sense, we at Regis have been given a real opening to reflect on how we can limit and shape our relationship to digital technology and thus our relationships with each other. My fear is that Regis will soon be back to normal, plugged in again, business as usual. You know, I think in November 9th, 1965, New York State blacked out, the whole state. And I remember being with my folks and my sister. With no power, we played cards all night instead of watched television. And it was so good. And then the power surged on around 11 p.m. And I still remember the sense of disappointment. My fear is that Regis will soon be back to normal, which would be unfortunate, not only because this kind of attack could happen again, and will happen again somewhere, but also because we would have passed up a conversation that is so important, not only for our own life and work at Regis, but for society at large, because our relationship to digital culture is one of the most urgent issues of our day. Just ask any parent of a teenager about the challenges of Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, and all the rest. My hope is that we who live and work in higher education can model a more careful, discriminating relationship with our digital technology so as not to be consumed in it or be surveilled by it. I just read Ed Snowden's a relationship that subordinates the purpose of digital technology to the purpose of our lives as a whole. Thank you.
A remarkable achievement here, but I think we're actually ahead of time on the schedule. So we have time more. We have time for questions. The amount of time that we have left is not an invitation for questioners to give their own papers. So, but if you would come to the microphone and tell us who you are, and then ask a question, and that might also give occasion for our three panelists to talk to one another a bit. As well, in addition to talking to the rest of you. Thank you. Questions, please.
Thank you for all your data to this on for the manager. I was wondering, moving forward, it sounds like your relationship began with the things you read about each other, and you had to make a decision not to read it and pay attention to it to actually have the friendship flourish. Any positive initiatives you can think at the beginning of the conversation for any of the panelists? I think most of us, speaking for myself, would agree unplugging is almost always going to make friendships and our lives, projects better. Do you have at least a seed of initiatives you can think of about how to help people start doing this instead of just having it die in the vine and people going back to business as usual?
Just a couple things about our work. We do three things. We do large public dialogues at the intersection of faith and public life. Because of the damage done to our family of faith, we've done a series on the clergy sexual abuse crisis. We probably work harder to get diverse points of view beyond the usual suspects. We did a session on the economy where we had the president of the AFL-CIO, we had a big shot from the American Enterprise Institute, we had a wonderful theologian, and we had a woman who was a cafeteria worker at our cafeteria. She was by far the most compelling, talking about what it was like to try and raise kids on her salary. Candidly, it is hard to get people to engage. Georgetown has a particular reputation. It's hard for us to get conservatives to engage. We work hard to do that. I said there was a hunger for what we do. We've probably now done 70 of these in 6 years. We've had 30,000 people come to those almost. And a lot of them are the same people with the same hunger. But Kim and I talk about the sessions we do with young people where we deliberately try and bring young leaders together across political, ideological lines.
Just very briefly, yes, we just, these are our Salt and Light programs where we have young Catholics in DC come together to talk about how they can integrate their faith in their professional lives and in their work in life in DC. And I'll just say they're fantastic. It's a great opportunity to meet, have shared food, all the rest. But we just had one, just to give you a sense of how these generally go. That was on keeping your faith in demoralizing times, where we had, again, a range of people come. And what's so amazing with young people in these conversations was that what they really wanted to talk about was the daily practice of prayer. Like, what do you actually do to say, how do you keep your lives from getting, they were asking the people on the panel, how do you keep your lives from getting cynical and too busy and all the rest? And how is that conditioned by your prayer life, by your relationships, et cetera? It was fascinating. I want to say one more thing to catch our breath. I sort of powered through the first part about what Michael was talking about and about your question about being unplugged. Because that's something that I've thought a lot about from where I have probably the most practical wisdom, which is as a mom. Our kids would say that we were the Amish family at our parish school because we had no screens for a long time. We finally got a television, and my parents and extended family are coming for Thanksgiving this year, and they asked us if we had gotten new tinfoil, which most of you won't even understand, but we had a antenna that had tinfoil on it to make it work. And that's how we approached our lives with our kids and continue to. Maybe a hermeneutic of suspicion is what you might say about technology. And the first thing I'll say is that what it brought forward the most is a sense of peace and calm in the house that I think was just, our older kids look back on that, and that's what they'll say. That it was just at night, it was quiet, it was more calm. And I could go on, and I won't about this. They'll enjoy that I'm stopping talking about it because it's a particular concern of mine. But what I will say is that in my professional life, I can't do that. And a lot of you will have that same, experience as well. And so instead of that, I think that it's important to follow some rules of the road. And instead of doing things like retreating completely from social media when you can't because of your work, or instead of calling everybody who doesn't exactly agree with you a heretic, or what have you. I think it's going back to maybe a Salesian principle, right? St. Francis de Sales, be who you are and be it well, which means living mercy, which means living our faith right there online, and also knowing when to step back and when to give yourself time for prayer and peace and all the rest.
Another example of our differences, I'm a political junkie and a sports junkie. There are miracles in this world. The Nationals won the World Series. Big deal. My new favorite theologian is Davey Martinez, the manager of the Nationals, who said, bumpy roads lead to beautiful places. I hope that's true, because our church, our country is in a really bad place, and it's going to take a lot of bumpy roads to get there. But I'm an addict, and so I don't agree. I explained to my wife Linda, the part in Laudato Si that's against air conditioning was not infallible. And with Tim, I want
All Texans, thank you.
but building on something I said, there is something about a pope that looks at the world from the bottom up and from the outside in that challenges me in fundamental ways. And I think when we try and fit him into our ideological, doctrinal wars, we miss the fundamental challenge. If I learned a ton from John Paul II, who grew up resisting communism. I learned a lot. As somebody in the social teaching of the church, I think Pope Benedict was the most powerful teacher of Catholic social thought, and I didn't expect that. But I am challenged every day by Pope Francis, who looks at the world differently. And instead of trying to use him or oppose him or resist him on the battles we've had for the last 20 years or 40 years, which frankly is a very modest interest to my children and a lot of young people, we ought to understand the challenge is far more fundamental. A universal church where North Americans are 6%, a world that is divided in fundamental ways, a world that doesn't look like us. And when he talks about a poor church for the poor, he's not talking about me. He might be talking about my parish, which is increasingly Latino. And when somebody, a big guy, said to me, Pope Francis is a divisive figure, I said, you need to get out of your bunker. In my parish, he's a uniting figure, because it's increasingly Latino, and they feel they have a voice in this church. So part of my appeal is broader perspectives in who you know, who you listen to, who you read, who you argue with, who you respect will benefit all of us. And making friends of some of those people will enrich your life.
You want to say something? I want to say so much. I'll try to do it quickly. I'll tell a quick story. On the day after the 2016 election, I was teaching world religions, and we were on Buddhism or something. And I said, we're not gonna talk about Buddhism. We're going to talk about what happened yesterday. And so, you know, I had the students say, I put on the board, why would someone vote for Hillary Clinton? Why would someone vote for Donald Trump? And we listed all the reasons, and some that, you know, they had reasons. And there were some sharp words in the class. But it was a great class, it was a great discussion. After the class, about 30 students, 4 students came up to me and said, thank you for doing that, because I haven't felt that I can talk. And they all voted for Trump. And I was sensitive to that because I have some friends, Rick Garnett has some friends in Colorado. I'm thinking of Martin Nussbaum, who's a lawyer, and he voted for Trump. And I love Martin Nussbaum. And I did not vote for Trump, but I did not vote for Clinton either. I voted for Ralph Nader, as I have every election since.
That's working well.
It costs a lot less money. What I find with someone like Martin is he's haunted by abortion, which I believe we all should be. And, you know, I read it, we've all read Evangelion Vitae. And he can say which federal judges, blah, 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 you know. And he's got his reasons. And I find it hard to dispute them, but I find the problem with his point of view and with the inverse point of view, the mirror image point of view. How could you ever vote for? The agenda is to win the state for Catholic socialism. And in taking up that agenda, Catholics have gotten won by the state, absorbed into a political culture that is divided so that we have our own Catholic little ways of being divided. And I don't think there's any way to avoid this unless we learn to unthink the politics of the state and operate on a more local level. In some ways, that's an implied position in my remarks about Regis. Is there a way that we can be free? And there is. And of course, I invoke someone who all the bishops universally approved his canonization to Rome, Dorothy Day. Though if they had read her writings, they would never have done it.
Can I just real quickly say something about that, because I think it's so true. First of all, there's a great article today about Dorothy Day as the saint for combating polarization. That's out, take a look, and I completely agree with that. But secondly, John Vanier died this year, and one thing that I've really taken to heart as I continue to read and study him is his idea that we're not called to be a solution, we're called to be a sign. And I think that that's really true when we talk about how we engage in public life, that we're not here to capture the state, that we're here to witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we need to do that in how we act and in substantively what we talk about as well, but also in how we live and witness.
Yeah, I know there are going to be lots. I'm on pushback, and I'm always anxious. I'm pushing back against Michael. I can understand and respect that. One time I was so frustrated, I voted for Cardinal Bernardine for president. And I saw him, and I told him I had voted for him for president. And he said, "Oh, John, I couldn't serve. The Holy Father says clerics can't serve in partisan offices." And I said, "Well, you didn't win. You lost 2-1 to Mickey Mouse in my precinct." I don't know if that was a good thing. It made me feel pure and all that. I think we have a responsibility to engage in politics because it's about life and death and war and peace. I have a student in my class. You can imagine a Georgetown seminar. We got lots of really smart people. They're all going to be Secretary of State, And one kid, we're discussing immigration, and they're going back and forth, borders, and da-da-da-da. Well, one young man raises his hand and said, "My mother cleans other people's houses, and she's undocumented, and every night I call her to make sure she didn't have a traffic accident or wasn't picked up because she might be deported." And that is a policy of our government. It's done in our name. And we have a responsibility to do something about that. And we're a church, my parish, increasingly Latino, we're learning, that this is a big church and there's more than one or two issues that affect human life and dignity. And by listening and learning and acting as citizens, we can make things better or we can make things worse. When we adopt the tactics, the divisions, when we reflect the polarization. One of the tough things is, does your faith shape your politics, I said. Are you more Catholic or more Democratic? Are you more Republican or are you more Catholic? The best evidence is we vote our party, our class, our prejudices, our ideology, then we even think much about faith. So we have a lot of work to do, but I think engagement is frankly required because of matters of life and death.
Maybe we get a quick comment from Mike and then a question.
We go on a long time. Let me just pick up one thing. I didn't say don't be engaged. I didn't say withdraw into your pure little enclave. That's from a conceptual paradigm that arose from Max Weber, was made popular and powerful by Reinhold Niebuhr, and has dominated Catholic social thought in addition to Protestant social thought ever since. In terms of engaging, I think the divisions historically, the divisions we have now, historically they became very evident in 1961 when Mater Magister was published, and the big reaction against it by Buckley and company, and Gary Wills, who wrote the editorial. And then the challenge of peace. That's where the divisions became overt. So this very idea that we're going to address the public square is what brought, I think, the neocons to kind of strike back. The empire strikes back. And those have been the divisions we've had ever since. Anyway, I want to hear other people's.
Okay, probably have time for one more question, I'm guessing. Go ahead, right there.
Okay. Jim Keating from Providence College. I sort of get a little deja vu the idea that Catholic social teaching is going to bring back the young. I think we've done that before. It's going to be Christ that brings back the young. But one of the things that I would ask is, for parents trying to raise their children in the Catholic Church today, and hoping that at least one of them, regardless of how many they have, will end up being in the Catholic Church. You mentioned that at the very beginning. I would hope, because with all due respect, I heard a lot of slogans, and it left me really cold. Because the Catholic Church most likely has a terminal disease. I hear the American Catholic Church. We built up all these institutions, and now we're trying to prop them up, while all of our young leave. Right? It is. To say it's a crisis is almost an understatement. It's most likely a terminal disease, and there'll have to be death, much more death than we've actually countenanced before there's going to be life. And I'm sure a lot of Catholics sit and listen to officials from the Catholic Church speak on these matters. I read Bishop Barron's, he's a fine fellow. I read that book thinking I could give it to other people. I would never do that in a million years.
The Sex of this one book?
The letter to a wounded church.
Yeah.
Because it assumes that the institutions that we've built up, which are a lot of them are of man, not of God, and we're talking about the American Catholic Church, are going to somehow survive. And they're not going to survive. We're going to have to give them up, and we've given them up in many ways already. So I would wonder, you say the wounded church, I would say as far as the institutional church in the United States, the wound is fatal. And it's time we recognize it so we can move on to something else. And I don't mean some crazy, I'm not talking theologically. I'm talking about the patterns of behavior, many of the ones that Pope Francis has written. These have killed the church. They've killed the faith of our young. They've made it almost impossible for parents like me to convince our children to take their parents' religion seriously.
Nice start.
Yeah, and we're coming up against the clock, so this could, as Professor McIntyre was saying, in response to each question, we could have a whole conference. So let's compress a whole conference into about 3 or 4 minutes.
So I'll just take one of those. I'll try to just take one of those minutes, but it's hard for me to limit it because obviously that's the most important question to me. I have 6 children. All of them are very different. And so what I've learned from that is that the way I thought that I would bring them, keep them in the church and keep them close, I had a very set way for what that was going to look like. I have 6 very different children. And so I learned a couple of things through that. Some of them are the slogans that we talked about here, which is keep prayer and the sacraments close in our lives in a way that is respectful and nuanced with everybody. Keep gospel close and keep our principles close. But most of all, it's about an encounter with a person. Some of that means the direct people that we're serving. We talked about Sister Norma, who's not a sort of factotum of the institutional church or anything like that. But most of all, it's in our daily lives and in the community we build. And I'm just going to get back to what Michael was talking about. It's in building a Catholic community, a culture of life and love in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. That's very important. But again, these aren't mutually exclusive. We don't leave the church behind when we work to do that.
You know, some of you know this, I have very strange history. I have 2 kids that are 3 and 5. Can you believe this? And you might guess, based on my paper, that I'm an older parent. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't find a parish that I feel comfortable with, but I know this. They have this program now where you take the kids out during the gospel and teach them some stuff and bring them back. And I've decided I don't want to do that. Because one, it's like class, it's like school, you know, not helpful. And the second thing is an essay that was written on transubstantiation by Elizabeth Anscombe, where she says, the way you teach a small child, everything you need to know about the Eucharist, you can teach to a small child by when the priest elevates the host, you point to it and you say to them, do you see that? That is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's all I do. That's my religious education to my 5-year-old. That's all I want him to know. He's too distracted to know much else. And we have coloring books and all that. But I feel like if he can make sense of that statement and the life that accompanies that statement, Anscombe was a Wittgenstein, we'll be okay, I think. But I'll let you know in 20 years.
John, briefly.
Very briefly. We're really sick. I don't know if it's terminal. If we let it run its course, it will be terminal. I don't believe that. We've got to do the research, but I think we have to stand up against that. As I said earlier, I find a hunger for what we have to offer, but I find resistance because of the contradictions of the institution. So the institution needs to reflect the values. We need to practice what we preach. Frankly, our divisions are very much in the way. Two things. David Brooks at one of our sessions, I think you know David, Jewish interest in Christianity and trying to find his way. We said, what about Catholic social teaching? And he said, frankly, it's all we got. It's the only coherent defensive community against radical autonomy that's really been thought through. So it is for me and for others a framework. Secondly, Jesus, the sacraments, the mission, it's what keeps me from being a terrible person and gives me hope of being a good person. And I want that for my kids and my grandkids, and I want an institution that shares that in an effective way. And I think we're here because we want the body of Christ to proclaim the gospel of Christ in a way that wins the day and helps us find our salvation.
John, Kim, Mike, thank you very much.